My name is Charmin Gabbard, and I'm a person in long-term recovery. The diagnoses that I have are I have bulimia nervosa, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress syndrome. I have a substance use disorder from both alcohol and drugs. I was born to a father that was an untreated alcoholic and a mother that had a gambling addiction. And I feel like early in my childhood, it seems as if the stage was set for me. I was born, we lived across a creek on 11 acres, and I had a couple relatives. My grandma lived over there as well. Um, but we lived out in the country, very rural area. And so oftentimes when the things that went on in my house, all the fighting and all the violence, and when my dad would be beating my mom and like the blood curdling screams, no one ever came to help us. And um, both of my parents later in life were diagnosed with their own mental health issues. They both were diagnosed with anxiety, depression, and my mom was diagnosed with having schizophrenia, which this later helped me put into perspective a lot of things, and it helped me with being able to forgive my parents. For me, my earliest childhood memory comes from, as I said, hearing my mom and those blood curdling screams coming from the kitchen in an old 4-room shack, dirt floors and no running water. My mom begging my father not to kill her as he held her against the wall, screaming with rage how much he hated her. My dad was always, always telling her how much he hated her, the words that he would call her, and the just yelling at times that he was going to break her fingers because, as I said, she had a gambling addiction and he was an untreated alcoholic. and my no one ever came to help. No one ever interfered. And I remember so many times I would just be standing there and just begging my dad to stop. And siblings, they would go to the creek and then um I just like it was almost everyday life. I learned three things very young: don't talk, don't tell, and don't feel. I never knew what to expect when my father would walk in the door from work. Sometimes the bill collectors would call or the repo man would come to the house that day, and I would learn quickly by the kitchen table being flipped or coffee being thrown at my mom. In my mind, I remember times that when like if the repo man would come, then we would all be hiding down by the creek, yet it still wasn't far enough away to hear her crying for help. The physical, mental, and emotional abuse was a regular. It was regular in our home. And after the fights, my father would leave in his truck, and my mom would go to bed with all of her wounds, crying, while us children would be left to clean up the mess. And then when my father returned, everything was as if it never happened. No apologies, no explanations. It was just done. My mom would, like, when us kids would be crying, she would just hush us. Like, it's just hush. Instead of, you know, trying to comfort us, it was always just hush. My mom would say she stayed because of us kids. My dad would say he stayed because of us kids. And I think that reflected a lot of guilt in my mind on me, and a lot that I didn't realize until later in life that I carried. My next significant childhood memory, I was taken out into the woods by three male relatives and molested. And for me, the fear of my father beating me was greater than keeping that secret. I can remember as a small child, like, there were so many things in my family, and my name was Charmin. We were very poor. And I started school in the first grade, and other kids always made fun of me. My siblings were bused to in-town schools because they were labeled slow learners. They said they were special ed students. And I remember there would be times where I would intentionally fall in the creek just so I wouldn't have to go to school. I didn't want to be made fun of. I never fit in with the other children. I had a speech impediment and my name was Charmin. Plus, I had a mouthful of cavities. I don't even recall having my first toothbrush until I was in the third grade. um, in elementary school, there was a time when I finally told someone about my father beating my mom and hitting her over the head with a gun. And my hopes were that someone would help us. But that woman didn't. And I believe from that moment on, I had lost the courage to ask for help. And that just died inside of me. As time went on, I became more insecure around teachers and other adults. Around 9 years old, I had my first drink of alcohol. And around the same age, my mom started taking my sister and I to the store to steal. I think I switched roles with my mom. I would lie and cover up for her so that my dad wouldn't beat her. And back when I one of my memories is that the electric bills used to come on this little card, and so it would come in the mail, and then my mom would take me to the library with her, and she would use whiteout, and she would always cover up like that past due amount and type over it as my as to think that my dad wouldn't figure it out. um, um, but of course he always did, because things just would the electric would get shut off, or it always come to surface. And when there would be times when, like, my dad would tell her if she didn't get help that he was going to leave her, but it was never like a family problem, it was always just her problem. And so for me, I wanted to protect her, so I lied. And then when she the store to shoplift, she would have us just steal things that she could try to compensate for the money that she was using that she was gambling away. We would be there by ourselves. I can remember like Easter services and all these little girls wearing pretty little dresses and their families there hugging them and just being there. And I knew we were different. But one thing that came from that was there was this woman that would always sing, and this woman had such joy on her face and peace. And I think somewhere deep inside, I longed for that in my life. I just didn't know how to get it. I wanted what I saw on her face inside of me. So, as I started getting a little, I left that little country school and ended up going to junior high in town. And so it didn't take long for me to find where I felt that I fit in. I became everything that I hated about my father. I was angry and I would fight. Kids made fun of my siblings, my sister especially, and I would just fight, trying to protect her. Um, over over my teenage years, I had had several suicide attempts. I had no self-worth, and as a result of multiple untreated diagnoses combined with my substance use disorder, I ended up serving over 10 years of my life in the prison system. I I had my first child 2 weeks before 18 years old. Um, Prior to having my son, I was placed in an adult treatment center at 17 years old, and I had at that time I had acute liver damage from alcohol poisoning. So it was just a constant cycle of uh, like skipping school for me and not wanting to be in that home. Anything that I could do to not have to go home, I would do. I had 2 suicide attempts before I was 16 years old, and the second one, I was rushed to a hospital in Indianapolis. They thought going to have a I was going into cardiac arrest. And I remember when I was my memory of being in the hospital, they back then they used a substance called charcoal to try to flush the fluids out. And I remember everybody just being so angry. The nurses, the staff were angry. And when I came when I came out of that, they told me that my parents weren't coming. And that's when they said that my parents weren't coming. I I just wanted my parents to love me, and I guess I just had such a mixed way. I didn't know how to handle life, and using substances became like my coping mechanism. But when it never made sense to me, the things that I wanted from them I couldn't have. It just wasn't a reality. after that uh after that last overdose, I was found in a yard, uh naked, and I never found out what had happened or how I even got there. um it wasn't long after that when the I tried to go to school, but I just didn't have any credits. So I did attend school off and on up until my senior year, and after that I ended up quitting school, and I had met my oldest son's dad, and we ended up leaving Indiana and going to Mississippi, because I thought that that was like the answer to all of my problems, and he was just going to be the one, you know. But again, I had my son 2 weeks before I turned 18 years old, and the cycle that I ran from in my family, the cycle of abuse continued. I continually would go with men that would abuse me, and he ended up being incarcerated, and I came back to Indiana. And once I came back to Indiana, I was a single mom with a toddler. I already had I already had an active substance use disorder, and then being young, and in this community, doctors were prevalent that wrote. So I started being prescribed benzos and opioids. And from that prescription at around 20 years old, and I had another addiction. I had a shoplifting addiction. So the combination of things in my life ended up um, rotating me in and out of the prison system. I've served 10 years of my life in prison, all for low-level nonviolent offenses, from shoplifting to driving while suspended, driving under the influence. And I would get out of prison, and for a little while I would do okay, but I would go right back into the same toxic environments, and nothing changed. I would promise the world while I was incarcerated I wanted to be different, but I didn't know how to be different. And I still had all this untreated trauma and mental health issues. I I often say that I personally feel like incarceration amplified my problems because I'm a sexual abuse survivor of both rape and molestation by both male and female. And from the moment I walked into the system, being stripped down naked in front of officers, being treated as a number, that's been one of like the most degrading feelings ever for me. And having to face it sober, hope mechanism that I ever had in life. The only escape that I ever had was a substance. I ended up there were so many times like going to doctors and getting that permission statement. I remember one time when the doctor took me from giving me 120 opioids a month as a prescription. I would take 20 at a time, and they would all be gone in 2 to 3 days. And then he took me from that to morphine, and then from there I I remember the day that I done an 80 milligram oxycontin, and I no longer got high. And by that time I had my second son, and I ended up leaving my second son's dad, and I ended up with a guy um, that was he was a monster. Uh, he literally locked me in a basement and held a gun in my mouth. And the things that he done to me now, I just like are unthinkable. And to think that I lived through it, and my kids were in the other room. I was so like afraid of him, yet so sickly twisted and stayed in this situation. Like the drugs were so powerful, the hold that it had on me, and I lost everything. I had lost everything we had. I sold everything we had, um, for drugs. And one time I got enough. He had locked me in the basement, and I climbed up over the rafters. And my youngest son was 3 years old, and he was outside playing. And and I knew, like, I had to go get help, and I ran, and I kept running, and he had grabbed my son and pulled up as I was knocking on a door down this gravel lane, and he said, "Come on, Charmin, get in the car." And I stayed. Done to me. I remember one time I said to him, "If you love me, then why do you hurt me?" But I think I stayed as repeating the same cycles that my mom stayed, and I stayed. And maybe that was just because I felt like that's what I ended up um I ended up getting arrested for driving while suspended and shoplifting. And I went back to prison, and by this time my kids were, my oldest son was somewhere around 17 years old, and my youngest son was uh around 4. I went back. I done 14 months, and while I was incarcerated, I went into what was called a therapeutic community. And so during that time in there, it's prison treatment, the best that they can while incarcerated. And um, during that, I wanted to do different. And I started participating in some of the programs, yet I still didn't want people to know my deepest, darkest secrets. I didn't want people to know that my own dad had just stomped me and would beat me and my brother, and that my mom was this person that she was growing up, and the things that had happened to me in my life. I didn't want people to know that I was raped by the guy that ran the cigar store in our town. I didn't want people to know all those things about me. I didn't want people to know that my own cousins molested me. I didn't want people to know my deepest, darkest secrets. Yet I hated everything about me, and I just didn't know how to be different. So I started getting a little bit while I was in there, but I wouldn't give it all up. And I was released. And within 2 weeks of being released from prison, I started doing dope with at that, he had turned 19 years old. I was shooting heroin with my 19-year-old son. And I was released somewhere around February, January of 2013. And within 2 weeks, as I said, I was doing dope with my son. And it turned into driving to Dayton, Ohio from Connorsville. It's about an hour trip, and 2 to 3 times a day. And that was it. That's all my life. I was consumed by it, and all throughout raising Jordan, our relationship was good. We kind of, like, it was the best dysfunctional mom-son relationship I guess I could have had. Um, but like, we grew up, we were growing up together. But when I started doing drugs with him, um, it was that, like, the sickest thing that I could have possibly done to a mom. And then have, like, during my sicknesses, when I didn't have dope, I would be on the couch, and my littlest guy I wouldn't even be able to get up off the couch to fix him soups. And I didn't want to be a mom. I didn't want to be anything anymore. And so July 3rd, I was arrested going to the city to get dope about 1 o'clock in the morning. And when I was arrested that night, all I could think about was poor Charmin, and feeling sorry for myself, knowing I'm going back to prison. I'm on parole, and I just couldn't do it anymore. I didn't want to live anymore. Everything that I wanted to be in life, the mom that I wanted to be, I couldn't. It just wasn't realistic for me. Uh, the people that stood by my side, which were my parents, were also the people that I was the most resentful toward. And I remember when the jailer was booking me in, I was already high. I didn't even need to be going to the city, and he kept saying, "Charmin, stay with me. Charmin, stay with me." And uh, when I got back to that little holding cell, I had planned to kill myself. I made a plan to complete suicide. I didn't want to live anymore. And that I kept calling my mom, calling my mom. Of course, I wanted that call for bond me out. And that last ditch effort, and my mom and my oldest son came to the jail for visitation, and I looked at my son and I told him, I said, I'm not doing it, Jordan. I'm not going back. And he said, Mom, you have to. He said, I'll be fine, but Drayden needs you. And Jordan was just 19 years old. And one of the things that he said to me is, Mom, it's not the mistakes that we make, it's what and if we learn from them that counts. And luckily for me, that evening, even in all my mess and all my tears, and a woman from outside came to the jail that evening, and she was there for jail ministry. And I believed in God, but I didn't really feel like God applied to my life, because all of my childhood prayers went unanswered. Like, there was never anyone that came to help my mom, or to, like, there was just never anyone to say, you kids deserve better, or like, do you have a dream? The only dream I ever had was getting out of that house. And then I had my own kids, and then I ended up putting them in the same toxic environment and the same cycles of dysfunction. That woman said, no matter what you've done. And she said to me, she said, Sherman, I sucked as a mom, but I'm a darn good grandma. and for whatever reason that night, there was like a little seed planted, and it gave me this little glimmer of hope. And I knew that I wanted more. And selfishly, I didn't want my mom and dad raising my youngest son because of the way I was. And so moving forward for me, a lot of things happened, and I ended up bonding out of jail, and my son too got to ride that little church bus, and my youngest son, and while I was incarcerated in that little county jail, he would go to church twice a week all by himself, and he just had so much joy, and he asked me to go to church with him, and I promised him that I would. And when I bonded out, I called the church and I said, because I didn't drive, and I said, can I ride the church bus with him? And I don't have a dress. It was a little old Baptist church, and the lady said, yeah. So I ended up going to church with him that night, and all of these kids just singing, and there was just so much joy in all of these kids that were probably kids like my son that didn't have moms or dads in the home, but they had so much joy, and I wanted that in my life. I'm so sorry. So I ended up trying to push the court dates back and whatever, but it finally came, and I was sentenced back to prison for 14 months. February 28th, of 2014, I went back to prison, and I made a commitment to to myself to I wanted to live. I didn't want to die. And I wanted a better life, and I wanted to be a mom. I just didn't know how. And I knew I needed a relationship with God. And what I knew at that time was the 12 steps of recovery worked. When I went into jail, and I was there, and during that time, I would call home, and my youngest son was around 6 years old then, and he didn't want to talk to me, and so he was mad at me. He came the night before I went to prison, and after they left that visitation that night, the jailer gave me a little piece of paper, and on that piece of paper it said, "You are so a good mom, and I forgive you." And I knew that if he could forgive me, I had to learn how to forgive those people that had hurt me in my life. I didn't know how. And when I got to prison, I was met by the director of that therapeutic community, and she came to the intake room, and she said, "Charmin, I'll give you 3 days to be in my office." And I'm so glad that she did. I was embarrassed to go back into that program, but I went. And she said to me, she said, "Charmin," she said, "the best piece of advice I can give you is to take this time for you. Hopefully, you'll never have another opportunity in your life like this, where your kids are taken care of and you can just work on you and focus on you." And so there was a woman that came from the outside that ran a 12-step group, and for women, and the woman was in recovery herself, and she came for 32 weeks every Tuesday, gave us 2 hours of her life while I was in prison during that time. I just didn't stop. I didn't stop reaching for motivational material. I didn't stop trying to learn about me and why I did what I did. I went to every Bible study, and then there was a group a Christian group called Heart of Christ Ministries, and they would come on Saturday evening, and and I would go every Saturday, and I would sit in the second row, and while I was working my steps, and I was in the process of the fourth step in the 12 steps of AANA is to make a searching and fearless moral inventory of yourself, and it's to set aside what others have done to you, but it's really all about you, your resentments, harms that you've done, and fears. And so while I'm working this inventory as well, Heart of Christ Ministries mentioned a radio station called K-Love, and I didn't even know what it was, but they mentioned the 30-day challenge. And so there were two stations that I'd started listening to there, and it was K-Love and iHeartRadio. And while I'm like every day during count time, I pray and ask God to just show me the areas in my life where I needed to forgive and where I needed to make amends. And every day we would, I'd be there during count, and I would just be working on this inventory, and I was honest and I was truthful in all that I did in this inventory. And I would stand in line waiting for wherever we would go, and I would be reading in my little AA book, like all of these little things, these little tools that I was starting to pick up, and I wanted so badly in my life. And in our program, we were allowed 1 hour a day at the rec. It was an inside gym, and the mentor that I had in the program, the director, she was a runner. And so I started running while I was in prison on a treadmill, and I was, getting something from it. Like I could feel the endorphins, so I was getting that natural high and learning a healthy coping mechanism while I was in there. But this one day when I went to the gym, I got on the treadmill like any other day, and I was getting ready. I was listening to the music, and I was going to turn the station, and I just had like this little tug in my stomach not to, and I set that little radio back down in the cup holder, and the song Amazing Grace by Chris Tomlin came on the radio. And I had the most awesome experience ever in my life. As I was running on the treadmill, I felt the Holy Spirit come over me, and I really didn't know what was happening, but it was filled with warmth, and tears just started coming out of my eyes, and I was running, and I was happy, and I heard, "You've been set free." I know the day that God took my addiction from me, and like it was the most high, and I was just like, it was the best feeling ever, and I couldn't wait to get back to the dorm, and so I could tell someone, because I had a fellow friend from back home that now has later passed away from overdose, and I would just seek wise counsel. She had so much knowledge of the Bible, and I, when I told her, and I actually journaled about that experience, and I still have it, and oftentimes I get to share it with others. But that was the day that I know he took it from me, and moving forward, I ended up graduating that program, and I made a commitment to myself that this is not my story, this is God's, and I just get to be a willing vessel. I went from being the girl that would skip school and absolutely had no self-worth, no confidence, and wouldn't even look someone in the eye, to leaving prison in April of 2015. When I left prison, I had a GED that I got when I was a patient at a stay one time in a state hospital, in Richmond State Hospital. When I walked out those doors, I was committed. I was committed to myself and to my recovery, and to God. I wanted to live for him. And so 5 days after I went back home, and I started staying with my parents. Uh, 5 days after I went home, I was offered a job landscaping and mowing, and I took it. And then my parents lived out in the country. So oftentimes I would go to town, and I would run back home, and just so I would have that transportation. So I would get dropped off, and then sometimes I'd run 5 miles just to get back home. I would go to town and volunteer at recovery meetings or whatever it was. But I started school that summer, and I I saved money for about 4 months, and I bought a little tiny trailer for a couple $100s. But it didn't matter. It was ours. It was mine. And then my youngest son came back to live with me in time, and I ended up getting my associate's degree in human services while I was working. And at times I would be working 3 part-time jobs. Last year in July, I finished my bachelor's degree in psychology, and the same week, the first week of July, I became a first-time homeowner and got my bachelor's degree in the same week. Um, about 2 weeks ago, I just became a certified drug and alcohol counselor. I have a CADAC 2 now. Um, I've got multiple certifications in recovery. I'm a recovery coach too. I'm a peer recovery supervisor, and I am the director of the harm reduction program here in Fayette County. I'm currently working with a team from Indiana University on $1 million grant here in our community. I'm getting ready to open up a harm reduction cafe. It's going to be called Connection Cafe. It'll be open here in just a few weeks, where people can just walk in and receive services in a judgment-free, stigma-free zone, whether it's mental health, substance use disorder, or they're homeless, whatever it is. I just want to be there to love and support them and connect them to whatever they need, or give them a cup of coffee. Um, and I guess that's about it. Oh no. So my kids, let me the best parts of my life. So today my son's 14 years old, and he lives with me. I have full custody of my son. He plays multiple sports. He's a freshman in high school, MVP of his football team. Very healthy, thriving kid. All of the normal things a teenager pretty much deals with in life. And then my oldest son now is 27 years old, and we just actually got back from vacation. He too has found his own pathway to recovery, and he has a job of over 4 years in the same place. And he actually became a homeowner before I did, and he has a wonderful fiance, and they both are doing amazing in life. Today, I have an amazing relationship with my parents, and I say because of a lot of my life changes, they started making life changes as well. Um, and I am a Christian, and a downside to not having a driver's license is that I asked my mom to take me to church, and my father had never went to church a day in my life. And since then, both of my parents have been saved and baptized, and they still are actively going to church. So God has blessed me abundantly, and today I do feel as if my childhood prayers have been answered.